Hi guys, I'm Remy.
I'm Lily.
I'm Layla, and today we're going to be looking at the question, how do different generations view deviance? We're going to be looking at the similarities and differences. We, in total, interviewed 10 different participants.
Yeah, and so we had a set of 9 questions, and then one of the questions had like a sub-question, and we asked all the participants the same exact questions and also collected their demographics. And so starting off, the first question was very general. We wanted to know how different participants with different generations view deviance. And so I thought when I was looking through the data, I found it was super interesting that older generations, like around the baby boomers, highlight how deviance can be different than the social norm. But when I was looking at the younger generations, such as the millennials, they seem to view deviance as something more like ridiculous or even like malicious. And that was also to go with the Gen Z as well. And so I think this difference can highlight how more experience with life and seeing how people react might alter and change people's views of deviance.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I was kind of expecting the reverse, that younger generations would have more of an open mind and older generations would have more of a cynical view. So I was really surprised by that, actually.
Yeah, I agree. When I was looking at it, at least because I interviewed my dad, his answers were very like broad and based off of like that like typical standard of what you would think deviance would be, and he wasn't really too specific about anything because he said it's very contextual and everything. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, totally.
And then the next question we had was, do you believe that younger/older generations are more deviant than your generation? So we're kind of looking at whether people think that people who are younger are more deviant than them or people who are older than them are more deviant. And the younger generations said that younger people were more deviant, while the older generation said that they're all equally deviant. And I thought that was really interesting. I think it could be because younger generations have a different view of the older generations as more of parents and grandparents and working people, whereas the older generations were around for their own generation to like be young and, you know, trying out different stuff.
We also saw similarities in like different arguments about how the media has a lot to do with that, where the younger generations are exposed to a lot more digitally and therefore can be more expressive of their opinions and feel the need to be a little bit more rebellious and go against social norms. So I thought that was quite interesting as well.
And also, I think that younger generations, they're seeing deviance happen in more day-to-day like contexts and experiences because, you know, they're going to school, there might be like a college student. So I think they might see a little bit more deviance on the normal day given someone that is working a job or that may be retired.
Yeah, totally.
And with our next question, so can deviance be positive? So this varied within different generations, and people said yes and no, but there was no correlation to age. What do you guys think about from our interviews?
I thought that was really interesting. Like when I first started taking the class, I didn't really think of deviance as being a positive thing. So I thought it was cool that people had an open mind about that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think people like hearing these answers, I think there could be a little bit more education that goes into becoming deviant. Deviance is this massive term, and I feel like a lot of people don't really understand what it means. And so, just like Remy said, I didn't really ever think about deviance being positive, but learning in class that, you know, deviance can be positive by being going to help someone instead of following the bystander effect. And so learning about that in class and learning about kind of the positivity of deviance was really, really cool to see. And I think when most people said it can be, the people that said no, well, I don't believe they're wrong. I think it could be cool to educate them and give them another opinion to think about.
Yeah,
totally.
I think it's just like in one interview, the interviewee said that they have to provide a path of reasoning to show, and they cannot argue. So giving reasons in those examples to why you're being deviant.
Right.
So
Definitely.
very crucial.
So the next question we asked is, in what ways may you be considered deviant? And it was interesting because a lot of people said, like, you know, they might not see themselves as deviant, but if they were to be deviant, they were very small acts. Like somebody said something about a religion, or someone said something about being an older parent. And so while this could be deviant because it's against the social norms, it's not something that a lot of people think of as deviance. And so I think if we sampled a bigger sample size or people in different areas rather than just the area that we were around interviewing these people, we could see a different trend. And when we learned about in class in January how a lot of people gave examples of negative deviance, this is a little bit different than what people gave examples here, but nothing's wrong or right, but it's just something to kind of think about that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I think it was a very big scale from what people were pulling from, whether
Right.
they were considered deviant or not.
Yeah, and then this relates to the class slides because it was also mostly negative deviance that people were giving examples of. Most people didn't say oh, I'm a better person than most. What came to their mind first was I don't follow this social norm, even though it was really small. I also think part of the reason people might not have been so forthcoming about their own deviance is just being shy and not wanting to share that.
Totally.
So the next question we had was, are all crimes deviant? And people had different answers to this. My participants, my grandma said no, and then my mom and my boyfriend said yes. So I thought that was interesting. That was also the first thing that I came to, was saying yes when I heard this question. So people had different thoughts on that.
Yeah, I thought this one was really interesting too. I initially would think yes as well, but I think it's also really important to realize where the crime is happening, in a different maybe country or so. Something here might not be deviant, whereas somewhere in another country it could be very extremely
Right.
criminal behavior. So
Totally.
And that's also what I was thinking of, crime can be very, very subjective. And so I think if next time, if we were to do it, we could maybe define crime so we can make sure everyone's on the same page. But I think that was also, but not defining crime is interesting to see how people respond. A participant that I interviewed who was a Gen Z, she was explaining how some people have reasons and intent behind being deviant. And so that was an interesting take because so she doesn't believe that all crimes are deviant. And so that was an interesting take just to kind of see if there's an intention behind it, does that not make it deviant, which is up to interpretation.
Totally.
And then the next question, so is deviance a trait you are born with? How does one become deviant? And also, do you think there are particular personality traits that are associated with deviance? So I would say that the majority of participants believe that it's not a trait that you're born with, but it's more something you're exposed to, socially. Although there was one person that said alcoholism, as an example, is genetic and that can be considered deviant. What do you guys think?
I kind of agree with it. I don't think not alcoholism. I don't think deviance is really a trait that you're born with. To me, it's more of a socialist perspective, and that kind of ties back into the Adler textbook on our reading for pages 11 through 56, and how they kind of all rejected the absolutist perspective that that's just who you are.
Right. And I think that in terms of the sub-question about what traits might kind of create this deviance, is we had some interesting answers. We had somebody kind of talk about risk-taking, while somebody else said ADHD. And so that was an interesting kind of take, because, if ADHD, that can kind of, I don't think of that as a quality, more of, something that you I guess it could be a quality, but more of something that is a, just part of who you are, and less of a personality trait. And so, but I think that could be interesting on how someone might think that those that struggle maybe with attention or are extra hyper might be more prone to deviance.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see that. I was a bit confused with that one at first.
Yeah, I was too, but I could see it. I don't know if I 100% agree with it.
Yeah.
But for sure.
I feel the exact same way. Yeah. And then our next question. Why do you think some people view deviance differently?
Yeah, that one was a really interesting one because we had a lot of different answers, and I had some people say that they don't, and that is, I never really thought about it like that. I always think people view deviance differently, But I think that, you know, if you don't, then there's more of like a one-way street to viewing deviance.
Mhm.
What do you guys think?
Because I interviewed my dad, and he said it's just a very broad term, and it needs to be taken into context with the situation.
Right.
And so he does think it can be viewed like very differently, especially like where you are and like how you grew up. So I thought that's initially like where I thought of like, oh yes, because I think like, oh, like what you learn, who you're surrounded with, like that's how I would view it, like how you grow
Right.
up, and like he said, like the context of the situation.
Totally.
Yeah, we had a lot of people say that it's due to different life experiences. So they took a relativist perspective from the textbook and recognized that people learn deviance, or not learn deviance, but their life affects how they view it and recognize it.
Yeah. So our next question was, what is the most recent act of deviance that you or you have either witnessed or carried out? And this was an interesting one because there were all these different questions or all these different answers, and a lot of them were like small things such as speeding, or like I had somebody say hitting a curb. And so, well, you might not think of that as deviance. Again, that is against the social norm, so that could be. Where my grandpa, who is a silent generation, said I'm not deviant. And so I think maybe, what do you guys think about older generations kind of seeing this deviance as like, that doesn't follow and like fit with me?
Yeah, my grandma also said that she's not deviant
Okay,
in any
interesting.
way.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of funny. But like my mom also gave the example of not liking Taylor Swift. So that was like a very minor deviant act. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it seemed to me that the older generations didn't think of themselves as deviant at all.
Right.
Yeah, and like my dad thought more so like the younger generation, like we talked about before. It's like, yeah, you're more like open to new opinions about
Mhm.
everything, so you're more likely to act in a certain way.
Yeah. And with this in our, like, the question we'll ask later, it was interesting because both Remy and I interviewed someone from the silent generation, and they both brought up politics. And so it's interesting because I don't think anyone else brought it up in terms of the other generations. And so seeing politics and people in power of within politics as deviant is also an interesting take.
Yeah, I think it's partly because the political climate is so different now from when they grew up. I think people are a lot more expressive and explosive with their views, so they recognize that that's different, whereas we're kind of being we're kind of learning about politics as it's happening.
Yeah, what do you guys think about that too? So it's like, depending on what side you are on, like the other one, would you say like that's a deviant behavior?
I feel like personally, I don't know if I would call it deviance, but I think a lot of people would. Because I think it depends on how open-minded someone is.
Mhm.
If someone realizes that I'm on a certain side of the political spectrum, but the other person is on the other one, but it's for they're valid for their opinions, then I don't think they would see that as deviance. However, if someone believes that because this person does not share the same political party, then they're flat out wrong, totally, I think they could totally see that as deviance.
And then the last question we had was, what is something that you think is deemed deviant today that may not be deviant in the future? And the youngest generation talked about social media and technology, how that's used today. The older millennials talked about relationships, while the older generations highlighted technology again.
Yeah, this was interesting because I think millennials, they're in the time of their life where they're starting to become and like have families, whether that's getting married or having children of their own. And so I think they might be a little bit more focused on, day-to-day relationships. But the younger generations and the older generations, the younger generations are full of, exposure to technology. But the older generations, it's something new, but I think that's something that's interesting to them. It's something that's like, because it's novel, it's very, very, like, they're more into it and learning about it. Whether or not they want to use it is a different question that, like, I think it depends on the person.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a cool kind of pattern there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting with the whole technology debate and everything, especially with AI, because one participant said that like when they answered the question, what ways might you be considered deviant, they said working with AI a lot. So it's
Right.
just like looking at like how we're using it now and what it's doing for us, and whether that like those benefits like outweigh like the cons of it, but even like how it's gonna look in the future. I mean, like as a marketing major, I feel like we have to be very open-minded to using AI, even though like I feel maybe a certain way about it.
Right.
So I think it also just like depends where you work, the industry, like it's very interesting to see how this will play out and whether it will be deviant, especially with all the dystopian movies that we
Yeah,
see,
exactly.
right? So
Yeah, and
I
I
really-
think all of these answers were extremely fascinating, and we learned a lot. It is important that this be, taken with a grain of salt to some extent, because we only interviewed 10 people, and most of them, I think all of them were people we knew. And so having a larger age range of different people, different data sets, different genders and stuff would definitely help make this project a little bit more replicable. But yeah,
I really enjoyed interviewing everyone.
Yeah,
and
this
this
is super
project.
fun.
Yes.
and I feel like it really helped tie the knot to the end of the class for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
Thanks for listening.